begin with verse 1. Before we do that, I just want to read that. I wanted to, Randy Frazee gives kind of an intro to chapter 12 in another book he's written and on this subject, and he tells a story about a little boy. And this little boy lived in West Texas and in a rural area, and what he loved it, but what he hated about it was they had an outhouse as their only facilities. And it was hot and humid in the summer and cold in the winter, and it always stunk. And he hated it. And he'd always dream, it was right next to a river, and he'd always dream if there was a way he could push the outhouse into the river and get rid of it. Then they'd have to get something else. And so one day they had this rainstorm, as sometimes they get in West Texas, and this river was really swollen, and he thought, here's my chance. And so he gets a 2x4 out of the barn and sneaks out to the outhouse and starts prying away and pushing and shoving, and sure enough, he got it to fall backwards right into the river and floated away. And he hoped that nobody knew he did it. You know, the wind blew it out. Well, that night at supper, his dad said, son, when you get finished here with supper, we're going to the woodshed. And hoping that maybe he hadn't been discovered, he said, why? And he says, son, I think you know why. And so he told his dad, yeah, I did it. I pushed the outhouse into the river. And there was silence, and he says, Dad, last week in school we learned about George Washington. And when he told the truth, he didn't get into trouble. When he chopped down the cherry tree, he didn't get into trouble. And his dad looked at him and says, yeah, but his dad wasn't in the cherry tree. Well, the truth is, we all hope we'll get by with the wrongs we do. We all hope no one's looking. We all hope no one notices. And we often think that our sin won't affect anybody else. Don't we? You know, it's my problem. Don't you worry about it. Keep your nose out of it. You know? I'm not hurting anybody. Isn't that kind of the attitude we have about our sin? And you know, we're going to see today in the story, that's pretty much the attitude David had. Let's start with 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. We'll stop there for a moment. See, after spending much of his life actively involved in warfare against the enemies of Israel, apparently David had turned a lot of that responsibility over to his military commander, Joab. And so he stayed home. And he's about 50 years old now, and he's spending time relaxing more, the way it sounds. And one evening, he's walking on his roof or patio, and he sees on another roof Bathsheba bathing. In those days, the roofs of a lot of homes were flat, and it was used almost like we use a patio today. And it seems that a sudden moment of weakness that David, had this lust. Now, that's how we'd like to say. It was sudden, it was lust, I couldn't help it, it just happened. Right? Wrong. David was becoming more and more lax in this area of his life. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, if you just turn over a few chapters, we see in verse 13, after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. And his activity was in direct violation to God's word to kings in Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning with verse 16, we read, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. So, David already was accumulating wealth, accumulating riches, accumulating concubines and wives. He was already being led astray by his sexual desires. And usually, a fall is that way. It comes as a result of compromise. It just doesn't happen. There's usually many compromises that were made. I remember a good friend of mine back in Gaylord, Michigan, he said, my dad-in-law always says, his favorite thing was, the kids would ask, well, why is this wrong? And he'd say, because of what it leads to. That's why. And they'd get so mad at him, what do you mean, because of what it leads to? And he said later on, as they grew older, his wife had said, my dad suddenly became very wise, because we suddenly learned what he meant when he'd always tell us, because of what it leads to. And in this case, that's what's going on in David's life. Instead of looking the other way, he apparently continued to look. His initial looking was what most men would do. If we felt we wouldn't get caught, guys, that's what we'd do. Apparently, his looking, though, led to lust. Now, some Bible teachers believe Bathsheba must have known that she was visible from the king's roof, but that's really not the issue. We don't know that, and we don't read that. The fact is, David was wrong. What David did was sin. And In fact, David, with these willful actions, they're inexcusable. He knew better. He found out who she was, he sends for her, and he commits adultery with her. Now, in David's mind, that was it. The event was supposed to be over. You know, a one-night stand. That's how a lot of people look at it. That's how they've done this over and over again in relationships. But it wasn't over. Bathsheba sent word to David that she was pregnant. And had David been just another king of that day, he would have simply took her into his home or whatever, and could have cared less, because in that day, pagan kings were God. They did as they pleased. They were a law unto themselves. But David is not a pagan king. He is no ordinary king. He had been anointed by God to lead the people of God. And the God who said in Exodus 20, 14 and 17, "You shall not commit adultery. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife." He clearly knew the commands of God. But David sinned against God. But as is so often the case, David didn't immediately confess his sin. He thought, like the boy in the outhouse, he could get by with it. Somehow we think, I can get by with this. Nobody will know it's me. And we rationalize, and we're thinking more in terms of people, forgetting that God sees everything and knows our sin. So he tries to cover it up, and David's panic in covering it up leads to more deception, leads to hypocrisy, and we'll begin reading again in verse 6 of 2 Samuel, verse 11. So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. And when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the palace with all the master's servants and did not go down to his house. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, "Haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and the Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David writes a note. Let's stop there for a moment. What's going on here? David is actually trying to get Uriah to sleep with his wife so he could get by with his sin, so no one would discover that the child was his. And this man, and then he tries to get him drunk, trying to get him to do what he wants him to do, but the man has so much integrity, he won't even go home to his own bed and his own wife, knowing that his fellow soldiers are sleeping out on the field, preparing for a battle. And yet, David has hardened his conscience. He's thinking totally about his own cover-up, how he can get by with what he's done. And David commits another sin. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." And Uriah Uriah ends up having to bring his own death note to his commander, not knowing that it was a trap for him. And he was put in the front of the battle, at the front of trying to capture his city, and he was killed in the process as David intended. How sad. From lust to adultery to murder and deception. The progression of sin. And how subtly we fall into it. Remember a verse in 1 Corinthians? 1 Corinthians 10, 12 and 13. 1 Corinthians 10, 12 and 13, it's one of those verses that everyone should memorize. I remember years ago memorizing this verse. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Why? See, because when you think you're strong, when you think this can't happen to me, when you think this is just somebody else's problem, look out. When you think you're strong, look out. You don't fall. In verse 13, no temptation has seized you except as is common to man. Oh, David did that? What a jerk. I'd never do that. Yeah, right. You'd never lust? Yeah, right. You'd never fall into sin? Except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. I just couldn't help it. I just couldn't say no. God says that's a lie. A deception from Satan. You could say no. You could help it. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will provide a way out so you can stand up under it. The way out for David was to look and say, oh my, and go back into his palace. That was the way out. Now, wasn't that hard? Wasn't it impossible to do? No, it wasn't impossible to do, but he chose to do what his sinful human nature was inclined to do and what our sinful human nature is inclined to do. And that's to keep looking and to keep lusting. And eventually to act on our lust and to sin. David caved into temptation, and the truth is, we as men are very vulnerable in this area of our life because we men are visually aroused sexually. Women, it's more touch and emotions. And so women, we need your help as men. As Christian women, God calls you to dress modestly. And as Christian men, God calls us not to lust. Now, you know, this is a problem from everyone, including me. Job, the most righteous man in the Bible that we're told about, in Job 31:1, what does it say in the Bible? It says, what did Job have to do to deal with this area of his life? He says, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a girl. He says, I had to make this covenant promise before God with my eyes that I will not do this. That means, does that mean that Job wouldn't appreciate a beautiful woman? No, that's healthy, that's normal. But it's those second looks. It's that staring. It's that lust. That becomes sin. Now, I understand there's a fine line here. But everybody needs to know there is a line. And if we don't, we're kidding ourselves, man. We need to take this seriously. We are no better than David. We are no better than Job. Now, I can just hear people say, well,